She saw the lights before she understood they could not be there. She had come down a long dusk grade toward a junction where two dead lines crossed, the light almost gone, the country going to that blue nothing that comes between the day and the dark, and out ahead of her at the crossing there was a tall, narrow building standing up against the last of the sky, and it had lights in it. Warm, small, steady lights. 3 or 4 of them, burning in the windows of the upper story and one high on a mast above the roof, amber and unwavering, and she stopped on the grade and looked at them and felt the hair go up on her arms. Because a building at a dead crossing on a line the world had forgotten does not have lights in it, and these had lights in them, and they were burning in the dusk the way lights burn in a place where someone is home. She was 19 years old, and she had learned to be careful of lit windows in empty country. Because a light means a person, and a person is the one thing in the wide world that a girl alone has real cause to fear, more than the cold or the height or the dark. And she stood a long while on the grade in the failing light watching the tower and the lights in it for any sign of a moving shape, a shadow crossing a window, a face, and there was none. The lights burned steady and still, and no one passed before them, and the longer she watched the stranger it became, because a person at home moves, casts a shadow, crosses a room. And nothing crossed these rooms. The lights only burned on in the empty windows with the patience of lights that have burned a long time and mean to burn a long time yet. She watched until the last of the day was truly gone, and the tower stood black against a black sky with only its lamps to place it, 4 in the windows and 1 high on the mast. And still nothing moved. And she came to a kind of certainty about it that she could not have argued, but trusted all the same. The certainty of a person who has spent her life reading rooms from the outside. That whatever kept those lamps lit, it was not a living hand, not tonight. That the tower was empty of everything but the light itself, and that made it a mystery and not a danger. And a mystery was the thing she followed. She went on down the grade toward the tower with the whole of what she owned on her back. 30 pounds of it. The folding knife and the matches in the bread bag and the tin cup and the candle stub and the soft notebook with the pencil and the little under $9 folded in the back. And she came to the foot of the tower in the last of the light and stood looking up at the burning lamps. It was a signal tower. An interlocking tower, one of the tall, narrow buildings that had stood at the junctions and the busy places of the old railroads, where a signalman had worked the levers that threw the distant switches and cleared or held the distant signals, keeping the trains apart on the crossing lines by the strength of his own arms and the sharpness of his own attention. She knew the kind. The lower story was brick and blind, a storeroom and the base of the thing, and the upper story was the operating floor. All windows, so the signalman could see his junction on every side, and it was in those upper windows that the lamps burned. And above the roof on an iron mast the highest lamp of all burned red and steady against the dark like a star that had come down to roost. The building was plainly abandoned. The brick was furred with moss, and the window frames had gone gray, and the weeds stood tall around the base, and the rails at the crossing were rust to the web. Everything about it said dead. Said years, said no one, except the lamps, which said, softly and impossibly, still here, still burning, still keeping the light. The door at the base was not locked. Its latch was worn bright in the middle of all the rust, worn bright by a hand that had used it, and she knew that bright latch now the way you know an old friend's knock. And she lifted it and went in, out of the blue dark and into the base of the tower, and a wooden stair rose ahead of her into the lit floor above, warm amber light spilling down it, and she went up the stair toward the light with her heart going, and came up into the operating floor of the signal tower, and stood, and looked, and understood, slowly, what a man had done here, and why, and how long ago. The operating floor was one long room walled in windows, and down the length of it ran the lever frame, a great machine of tall iron levers standing in a row, dozens of them, each one painted in a color gone soft with dust, red and blue and black and white, each one connected below the floor to the wires and rods that ran out from the tower to the signals and the switches of the junction, the interlocking machine that had been the whole purpose of the place. It was a beautiful thing even in its long dereliction. The frame, the levers standing tall and ranked and patient, each with its polished steel handle gone dull and its bright brass number plate. The whole machine speaking of a precision and an order that the moss-dead country outside had entirely forgotten. And she felt the pull of it at once, the pull toward the levers, the deep human wanting to put a hand on a beautiful machine and feel it move, and she noted the pull in herself the way she noted every pull, and set it aside. And along the frame, and on the sills of the windows, and hung from hooks in the beams, were the lamps. Signal lamps, the heavy railroad kind, brass and glass, with their great oil fonts below the burners, and they were burning, a half-dozen of them, their wicks turned low, their flames small and steady and clean behind the smoked glass, throwing the warm amber light she had seen from the grade, and she stood among them in the dead tower with the dust thick on everything and the lamps burning like the candles of a chapel that had lost its congregation but not its faith, and could not for a moment make it make sense. A warm and living light kept burning in the heart of a thing so plainly and completely dead. Then she found how it was done, because she looked, and looking was the thing she did instead of wondering. The lamps were fed. From a great tank up under the roof, a reservoir she would climb to and find, a tank the signalman must have filled with oil, ran a system of fine copper lines down to each lamp, a drip, a slow gravity feed metered so fine that a lamp turned low would sip its oil a drop at a time and burn not for a night or a week, but for months, for years, on the great head of oil in the tank above. And the tank had held enough, filled to the brim by a determined man, to keep a half-dozen wicks alive for longer than she had been alive. She traced the copper lines with her eye, and then, with her finger, the way they ran from the tank down along the beams, and branched again, each branch ending in a fine needle valve at a lamp's font, each valve set by a patient hand to pass one slow drop and then the next, and she saw the genius and the madness of it together, the enormous care a man had spent to build a thing whose only purpose was to keep some light in the world after he was gone, and she stood among the burning lamps and felt the presence of that care the way you feel a warmth. She understood, too, looking closer, that it was ending. The lamps were not all burning. More than half the frame's lamps stood dark and dry, their feed lines empty, gone out one by one over the years as the tank drew down, and the half-dozen still alight were the last of them, turned lowest, sipping the last of the oil. And when she climbed the ladder to the tank under the roof, she found it near dry, a shallow dark pool in the bottom of a great vessel that had once been full, weeks of burning left in it. No more. She had come to the tower on the last of its light. A few more weeks, and she would have come down the grade in the dusk to a dark building at a dead crossing and never known it had ever burned at all. On the desk by the lever frame, weighted under a signal lamp's spare red lens, there was a book, and she took it up and carried it to the light of the nearest burning lamp, and she read it, because the book was the kindness and the book was the rule, and she had learned in a rising tank and a laboring train's smoke and a flooding pier and a burning flue never to sleep in a stranger's house without first reading the thing the stranger left to be read. And this man had left a great deal. He had been the signalman, the towerman, the last one, and he had worked the junction for 40 years, and he wrote of it with a love the drifter girl had not quite met before. Not the fierce dutiful love of the watchers and the keepers, but something gentler, the love of a man for the small perfect world of his work. The levers, and the wires, and the trains he had never touched, but had moved. Across the country like pieces on a board, holding this one, clearing that one, threading the crossing lines through each other all day and all night for 40 years and never once, he wrote, never in 40 years, putting 2 trains in the same place at the same time, which was the whole of his art and his pride, the not happening of the thing, the accidents that never were because he was there, and awake, and sharp at his levers. He wrote of the machine with a craftsman's tenderness, of the lever frame and the interlocking beneath it, the bars and the locks that made it impossible, by design, to clear two signals that would send two trains at each other, so that the machine itself would not let a man make the worst mistake even if his attention failed, and of how he had loved that, the wisdom built into the iron, the way the machine held the same care he held, and would not let go of it. He wrote of the nights, the junction lit and busy in the dark, the lamps of his tower and the lamps of the trains, and the signals red and green down the four lines, and of how it had all been a kind of music to him, worked with his whole body at the heavy levers. A music of moving lights that he had conducted for 40 years. And when the line closed, and the signals went dark, and the levers he had worked for 40 years were thrown for the last time, and stood still, he had not been able to bear the dark of it. That was the thing he wrote plainly. The thing that had made him do what he did. That he could bear the trains being gone, but he could not bear the tower being dark. Could not bear that a place that had blazed with light every night for 40 years, a beacon at the crossing, should stand black and dead at the junction as though it had never been. And so he had built the thing with the tank and the fine copper lines, had filled the great reservoir to the brim with oil, and had set the lamps to burn low and slow, a light that would outlast him, a beacon for no train and no traveler, a tower that would go on burning at the dead crossing for years after his hand was gone, simply so that the dark would not have it, so that the light he had kept for 40 years would not go out the day he did. She sat with that a long time in the light of the last of his lamps. It was the most useless of all the things the keepers had done, and the most beautiful, a man keeping a light burning for nothing, for no one, against nothing but the dark itself, and she found it moved her past any of the others. The sheer stubborn tenderness of it. The bridge tender had watched his river to keep it from taking a bridge, the track walker had walked her cold line to keep the rails from breaking under a train, every keeper she had met had kept a watch that had once had a use, and had gone on out of love past the use. But this man had kept a thing that had never had a use at all. Not once. Not for a single night. The light he set to burn after him would warn no train and guide no traveler and be seen, most nights, by no living eye in all that empty country. It was a light kept purely against the dark, for the idea of light, because he could not bear a place that had shone to go black. And there was something in that, in the keeping of a beautiful, useless thing for no reason, but that it was beautiful, and that the dark should not have everything, that struck her as the truest thing any of them had done, and the bravest, and she looked around the tower at the half-dozen small flames, sipping the last of the oil, and knew that she had walked in at the very end of a thing that had burned for years, and that it was in her hands now whether it went out. But first she read the rule, because he had left one, set apart in the middle of a page with a line ruled above and below the way they all did, and it was not about the lamps or the oil, it was about the frame. Do not pull the levers, he had written. The wires are still live. The signals are gone, but the wires still run to the compensators and the weights. And 40 years of my pull is still in them, and rust has been eating them all the time since. And a wire that lets go will take your arm off or your head if you must cross the frame room. Keep low and keep behind the frame. Never in front of it, never in the run of the wires. She read that 3 times and looked at the great beautiful machine of levers running down the room. Each one a temptation, each one connected to the mystery of where its wire ran out into the dark country, and she understood the danger of it, the tons of tension still locked in the corroded wires and the counterweights, the lethal patience of a machine left loaded for 50 years, a thing that looked as dead as everything else in the tower, and was not dead at all, but only waiting, holding its enormous strain in silence the way it had held it for half a century, needing only the rust to eat one strand too many, or the cold to draw the steel 1 degree too tight to let it all go at once. It was the same lesson she had learned in every place, she thought, that the deadest-looking thing is the one to fear, the still water and the quiet gas and the loaded frame. And she marked the rule, keep low, keep behind the frame, never in the run of the wires, and she did not touch the levers, however they pulled at her, and she went to her bed that first night, a cot in the corner behind the frame where the signalman had plainly slept his own last years. And she slept in the amber light of the dying lamps with the great loaded machine standing dark and still down. The length of the room, and she did not pull a lever, and she was careful, going to her bed to keep behind the frame. The wire let go on the third day, and it let go because of the cold, not because of her, though she was in the frame room when it went, and she was alive after because she had read the rule. A hard, clear cold had come in the night, the temperature falling away to nothing, and in the morning the tower was full of the sounds of a cold building, the ticks and cracks of things shrinking, and she had thought nothing of it, had learned in the frozen trestle that a cold structure speaks and means nothing by it. But a signal wire is a wire under tension, run for miles over pulleys with a counterweight at the tower end to keep it taut through all the changes of heat and cold. And 40 years of tension and 50 years of rust, and one hard night of cold drawing the steel tighter than the rust could bear, was the thing that came due that morning. She would think about it after, the exactness of it, how the cold that had felt like nothing, like only the ordinary speech of a chilled building, had been all the while drawing the old wires tighter and tighter out in the dark country, over every frozen pulley, past the strength the rust had left them, so that the danger she had been warned of in general had been assembling itself in particular, all through the quiet night while she slept, and had come to its point that morning at the one moment she was crossing the frame room. But she did not know it then. She only knew, as she crossed, the sudden crack. It came due while she was crossing the frame room, and she was crossing it to reach the stair to the oil tank, because she had decided in the night that she would keep the light burning, would find oil somehow and fill the tank and keep the beacon the signalman had died keeping, and to reach the stair she had to cross the frame room, and she crossed it the way the rule said, low, behind the frame, out of the run of the wires, not because she felt any danger that morning, but because the rule had said always, and she had learned that the keeper's rules meant always. And she was behind the frame, low, halfway across, when the wire went. It went with a sound like a shot, the crack of the parting steel and then the whip of it, and the counterweight it had held taut for 50 years came down all at once with the whole force of its tons, and the freed wire whipped back through the frame room, back through the very space in front of the levers where a signalman stood to work them, where a curious person would have stood to touch them. A lash of steel cable crossing the room at the height of a standing person's chest at the speed of a thing released from 50 years of load, and it cut through the air where she would have been if she had crossed the room like a person, and not like a person who had read the rule, and it struck the far wall and tore a gouge in the brick and fell. And the counterweight crashed into the base of the frame and the whole machine rang like a struck bell. And then there was silence. The enormous silence after. She had dropped flat behind the frame at the first crack, the animal in her faster than her thought, and she lay there now with her face to the dusty floor and her heart slamming, and did not move for a long moment, taking the count of herself the way you do after, finding all her parts, finding them whole, finding herself alive. Then she lifted her head and looked, from her safe place low behind the frame, at what had happened in front of it. The wire lay across the room where a person's height had been. The gouge in the far brick was at the level of her chest. She understood exactly, lying there, that a man 50 years dead had just reached out and pulled her down out of the path of the thing, the way he had pulled every train he ever held out of the path of every train he ever cleared. The not happening of the thing his whole art, and it had held her too, the last of his interlocking, a girl kept safe across 50 years by a rule set apart on a page. She lay there a while. Then she got up, keeping behind the frame, and she went and looked at the gouge the wire had torn in the brick at the height of her chest, and she did not touch it, and she went on across the room low and behind the frame to the stair, and she climbed to the near dry tank, and she sat by it a while in the cold morning light. And then she came down and took up her notebook and wrote the rule first, the way she had come to. Keep low, keep behind the frame. Never in the run of the wires. She underlined it twice. And below it she wrote a second line: "He held the trains apart 40 years and never once failed, and he did not fail me either." She looked at that a while. Then she went on. She kept the light. That was the work she gave herself, past the ordinary keeping, and it took her the better part of a season, and it was the thing she was proudest of in all the places she had kept. She could not fill the great tank with lamp oil she did not have, and could not buy with $9 in dead country, and so she did the thing the drifter always did, which was to make do with what the country gave, and the country gave, when she went looking, the makings of oil. She rendered fat from what she could snare and trap through the turning of the year, cleaning it and clarifying it until it burned clean in a test lamp without smoking, and she found, in the tower's stores, the signalman's own laid in tins of oil not yet used, a dozen of them behind a panel in the base, his reserve against a future he had not lived to spend, and she pressed oil from the seeds of a stand of some hardy plant gone wild along the grade, patient a little at a time, crushing and pressing and straining, and she learned as she went which of her makings burned clean and which fouled the fine needle valves, and she learned to filter them all through cloth, and then through cloth again so the copper lines would not clog, and she carried what she made and what she found up the ladder to the great tank, a cupful and a canful at a time through the season, feeding the reserve faster than the last lamps drank it, and slowly, she brought the tank up off its dry bottom, and the level rose, and the lamps that had been guttering steadied and burned clean, and one by one she brought the dark lamps back, clearing their clogged valves and trimming their stiff old wicks until they caught and joined the others, and she turned them no higher than he had, low and slow and sipping, so the reserve she had fought for would last, and she kept the beacon burning at the dead crossing. The tower lit in the dusk the way it had been lit for 50 years, for no train and no traveler, against nothing but the dark, because a man had asked her to without ever knowing she would come, and because she found, keeping it, that she wanted the light in the world as much as he had. The days took on a shape. She learned the tower and kept it, low and behind the frame always, never touching the loaded levers, and she gave herself over a season to the slow, careful work of making the machine safe, cutting away the other wires at the tower end one at a time so they could not let go and whip, but doing it from behind, from the safe side, easing the tension off each compensator weight with a rope and a lever of her own rigging before she cut, lowering the great weights to the floor gentle instead of letting them fall, freeing the machine of its lethal strain a wire at a time until the frame room was only a room of beautiful dead levers and not a loaded gun. And it was slow and frightening work, and she did all of it, with the signalman's rule in her mind and her body always behind the line of the wires. And only when the last weight was down and the last wire slack did she stand, at last, in front of the frame where no signalman had stood safely in 50 years, and put her hand on a lever and draw it over and feel the beautiful cold machine move under her hand the way he had felt it move 10,000 times, the levers he had loved, and she understood, feeling it, one more thing about him, the plain joy of the thing, and was glad she had made it safe enough to feel. She kept his tank filled and his lamps burning. She swept the operating floor and cleaned the smoked glass of the lamps so they burned brighter, and she cleaned the great red lamp on the mast above the roof and kept it fed. The highest light, the one that showed farthest, climbing to it in the dusk up the iron rungs of the mast with a can of her hard-won oil, and she came to love the evening task of it, going lamp to lamp in the dusk, turning up the wicks a hair as the dark came on and down again as she went to sleep, tending the beacon, and she left untouched the small things that had been the signalman's. Out of the courtesy she paid all of them. She never learned the whole of him. She did not expect to. But she came to know the shape of his mind by keeping his light and living in the tower his life had filled, and she thought that he had been the gentlest of all the keepers she had found, a man whose whole art had been a kindness, the holding of trains apart, the accidents that never were, and whose whole last act had been a kindness too. A light kept burning for the sake of the light, and she understood him, the way she had come to understand all of them, and understood by now past any doubting that these places were not chance, that a girl who comes down the dead grades in the dusk looking for the impossible light in the window is exactly the person the keepers had kept their lights burning for, the one who would come at the last and read the rule and take up the keeping, and not let the long light go out into the dark. On an evening in the deep of the year, she sat on the operating floor of the tower by the lever frame, with her own notebook open on her knee and the signalman's ledger closed under its red lens on the desk. And down the length of the room and along the sills and up on the mast above the roof his lamps burned, a half-dozen and more of them now, clean and steady and low, the beacon full again, throwing their warm amber light out through the windows into the blue dusk over the dead crossing where no train would ever come. She had brought the tank back to the brim over the season, cupful by cupful, and had reckoned once, idly on the back of a page, how long the reserve would burn at the low, slow rate the signalman had set, and the answer had made her smile, alone, because it was years, more years than she cared to count, a light that would outlast this keeping the way it had outlasted his, and she had thought, setting the pencil down, that if ever she left this place, if ever the road pulled her on the way it had always pulled her on before, she would fill the tank to the very top before she went, so that the tower would go on burning at the dead crossing after her the way it had burned after him. Handed on, light to light, keeper to keeper, against nothing but the dark. She was 19 years old. She had a folding knife, a box of matches, a tin cup, and a little under $9 she had not spent, and now had nowhere to spend, and did not miss. She had a tall tower at a dead junction, a great machine of levers she had made safe with her own hands, a tank she kept filled, and a beacon she kept burning, a rule that had pulled her out of the path of the whipping wire, and a book she had not written full of the gentlest of all the lives she had found. She turned to a fresh page and smoothed it flat with the side of her hand, and around her and above her the tower burned in the dark the way it had burned for 50 years, and would burn now for as long as she kept it, a light for no one, against nothing but the dark. And she began to write, in the careful hand she was learning from a signalman 50 years dead, the first line of the keeping of the only home she had ever made her own.